Micheál, the unenviable task falls to you to make sense, if you can, of what was announced today. So maybe what changes are coming for new builds?
Well, there's altogether about 4 major changes. For new builds, the most significant change is that rent increases will no longer be capped at 2% per year, but instead will be capped at the consumer price index, in other words, inflation. That's the key change for new builds. For all other tenancies, all other properties, there's a number of changes. First of all, rent pressure zones, which currently cover about 85% of tenancies, will be extended to include the entire country. Second of all, and this is the major change, landlords will be able to increase rents between tenancies in order to bring up rents to market rate, which previously they were capped at 2%, whether or not they're renewing within a tenancy or between tenancies. And then finally, another major measure is major new security of tenure protections for tenants. So for smaller landlords with 3 or less properties, there will be 6-year tenancies, and crucially, landlords won't be able to issue a no-fault eviction notice within that 6 years. For larger landlords with 4 or more tenancies, they won't be able to issue no-fault evictions, full stop.
So for people who are in a tenancy at the moment, or for a landlord who's renting out a property, the old rules effectively still apply for a period of time. Once that property is vacated, do the new rules kick in? Does that 6-year ability to kind of reset the rents every 6 years, does that then apply to that property as well?
From March 2026.
OK, so eventually you'll have a situation where almost all the rental stock in the country will fall under the new regime, as it were. It'll take time, but it will happen eventually. Is that it?
Yeah.
All right. Well, listen, Marcus O'Connor is with us as well, as the Managing Director of MFO, the Property Professionals, and a member of the Society of Chartered Surveyors. Marcus, will this increase supply?
Well, that's a very hard question to answer. I think at the moment we are all trying to, I suppose, grapple with the details on this and how it will affect the rental property supply long term. What I will say is that whenever there has been essentially government amendments to the legislation, landlords have tended to react badly. And in the last, let's say, wave of changes, there were landlords leaving the marketplace because there was uncertainty. Landlords and investors tend to like to have a consistent market that's on an even keel.
But if that consistency wasn't allowing for big institutional investment, there is an argument that some tweaking had to be done, is there?
Well, certainly with regards to the supply of properties all around Ireland, they had no choice but to deal with it. I think that the devil will be in the detail when the actual legislation comes to play, particularly in regards to the definitions around certain elements of the law. What I would say there is that some of the landlords that I've spoken to today are certainly unsettled, and they are, very worried about the future, particularly the fact that they can't sell their property with full vacant possession, which is definitely going to affect the asset value of their property. And that's something that we have to look at very carefully.
And is that the aspect of today's announcement that would most concern you?
It would, certainly. I mean, in my business, we certainly deal with lettings, management and sales. And I've been in the business of sales for 25 years. And if you ask me, or I think any agent around Ireland, they will say the same. And that is, if you are selling a property with a tenant in situ, it is definitely going to affect the value of the property in a negative way. Now, of course, there's exceptions to every rule, but that would be my professional opinion on it, looking at what we've seen in the legislation and the proposed legislation. So I would be saying that maybe there should be a more careful look at the domino effect that this piece of legislation is going to have on the entire property market.
All right, listen, Marcus, thanks a million for that. Micheál, the whole point of this is to ultimately increase supply, is it?
So ultimately, the Housing Agency was tasked with reviewing the RPZs as part of Housing for All. And they've come back with a recommendation that they feel this is the best way forward. Ultimately, we want to protect tenants, not just in the original RPZ areas, but right across the country, including my own home county of Longford, where it wasn't previously. But we want to increase supply, and we've seen a dramatic fall in the amount of apartment building over the last number of years, particularly since 2022. It's fallen off a cliff edge. So we want to incentivise, the massive pension fund investments to invest into building apartments. And the reality is, if something isn't viable, you're not going to get a financial institution that's going to make the investment to actually build them. So this is our view as government, based on the recommendations from the Housing Agency, of a way of incentivising that investment into increasing the supply.
And just to be clear for people at home who are renting or are prospective renters, what that means in reality is that those pension funds, and we'll stick with that example, can charge higher rent.
We need to get bricks on the ground. We need to...
Oh, no, I understand that there's an argument, there's a trickle-down effect and that's a net positive. But ultimately, I mean, when you talk about, encouraging investment funds, be they pension funds and Canadian teachers or whoever it happens to be, to fund the building of apartments, and they're unviable at the moment, what we're talking about today with these measures is about charging more for rent to make them viable.
We want to increase...
we're not cutting VAT, we're not getting rid of other duties.
We want to increase the number of units that are available for rent in the country. The reality is it's fallen off a cliff edge. The investment...
I'm not trying to catch you out. I mean, it's straightforward enough. It is about making it viable by charging more for rent, isn't it?
It's getting the investment put in place to increase the number of housing units we have. That is what the aim of today is, and giving certainty and protecting renters that are in existing rent contracts.
Paul, what impact do you think today's announcements will have on the rental market?
We're going to see rents very rapidly rise. Rents have doubled over the past 10 years. That's going to now accelerate. That's deliberate government policy. You shouldn't believe it when they say none of this will happen until 2032, 6 years after 2026. That's not the case, because any tenancies that come to an end after March 1st, 2026, as long as they're not no-fault evictions, will be then subject to the new rule, so that they will be reset immediately to so-called market rate. Over half of all the tenancies in this country are less than 2 years, right? So you have a big churn in the rental market, and very, very quickly we're going to see big increases in rents. We're going to see increases in property prices, and we're going to find young people who are currently paying loads on rent are going to be paying more on rent, and then faced with property prices that are going up. We're going to have an increase in homelessness, because people are going to get to a point at the end of their 6-year tenancy or when they move because they have a kid or whatever, and they're simply not able to afford the new rent.
But we also ultimately have an increase in supply.
I don't see the evidence for that. Certainly in the short term, we're going to have an increase in vacancy, because if you're a landlord sitting on a property that is currently vacant, you're not going to rent it out now under the existing regime of tenancies of unlimited duration, where you're going to be capped by 2% for as long as the person stays. You're going to wait until the 1st of March 2026. You're also going to create an incentive for landlords to be bad landlords, right? To have constructive evictions. Every time that your tenant voluntarily leaves, you get to reset the rent to the market rate. You get to hike it up again. So this is a disaster. It really is. Under the guise of expanding the rent protection zones, in reality, they are being gutted, and people will be faced with, if they're in these, 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%, and then a massive hike that will be unaffordable. This is the reason that Raise the Roof is organising a major protest next Tuesday at 6 o'clock outside the Dáil, because we have a government made up of landlords, which represents landlords, that wants rents to increase. You won't come out and say it, but that is government policy, to want rents to increase. And the only way we'll stop them is if there's much more renters, there's much more young people who are locked out of being able to afford to rent, being able to afford to buy. We need to be on the streets to stop this government.
The government, the recommendations of the Housing Agency are the recommendations that the government has taken on board. And that is to look to try and increase supply and protect tenancies. The RPZs, that's what were brought in, was to protect tenancies, and we've expanded it across the country to make sure we protect those tenancies in every single county.
Carol, how do you think the market's going to respond to today's new announcement?
I don't even need to give my opinion. I can actually relay what's been told to me over the course of, I would say, up to 30 messages from 8:30 last night until midnight, because this industry doesn't sleep a lot, and all of today. And it's interesting, actually, the immediate response was, how did we go from debating the merits of retaining the rent pressure zones to suddenly the entire country's a rent pressure zone? So that feels like politics rather than policy. There was definitely a state of shock initially, but it's interesting when we break down what this actually entails. What we can see is making the entire country a rent pressure zone, but actually alleviating the impact of that. And it's interesting because about 2 years ago, as we were making more and more regional towns rent pressure zones, there was a call at that time to make the entire country a rent pressure zone. And at that time, it would have been the right policy. It feels like a soft way to achieve what needs to be achieved. And actually, I'm quite disappointed. I think it's not the type of emergency response that we had started to see in the last 2 weeks.
And when you say a soft way of achieving what we need to achieve, what do you mean by what we need to achieve?
Well, we know what needs to be achieved. We need streamlining of planning. We need more zoned land coming on stream. We absolutely needed better protection for tenants. It's something that Ireland has been lacking in the past. But we also need to make being a landlord viable and attractive in this country. And that's what we haven't done. And I genuinely welcome the distinction between small landlord and large landlord. And I am ever hopeful that actually I'm hoping that distinction will make it easier for the series of policies that we need to make people want to invest. But actually, based on what's been released so far, I don't believe we have that. There's nothing in there. In fact, and again, I don't need to rely on my own opinion. I can go through the messages that I've received literally in the last 24 hours. And there was a regional landlord in one of the regional cities has already spoken to people has already been instructed to start the proceedings to remove tenants from buildings. And some of the really disturbing things that we've heard are around particularly older property owners who never intended to be landlords, didn't want it, and this is absolutely interfering now with the potential of them being able to survive in older life. So they're not going to continue, and I don't see this attracting new landlords, private landlords into the market, but it does the job for institutional, and we need that too.
Micheál, I asked Paul, whether he thought this would lead to an increase in supply, and he said he hasn't seen the evidence for that. What is the evidence, internationally or even here in Ireland, as to what impact increasing yield has on international investment?
First of all, just to say, the Housing Agency report on the rent pressure zones that the government's measures are based on makes very clear that the measures will increase rents in the short to medium term. So that's very clear. Second of all, there's a number of factors at play. For institutional investment, which is new apartment supply, there's three main factors that are going to shape supply: the rent pressure zones, interest rates internationally, and construction costs. So the government have addressed one of those. The other two are much more difficult to address or impossible in the case of interest rates. It's unclear the new situation, how things will play out. However, my view is that the key measure is being able to reset to market rate between tenancies. Most tenancies in Ireland are short, so we would expect rents to be resetting to market rate within a relatively quick period. And it was the long-term 2% year-on-year cumulative effect of the previous caps that made, for some perspectives, that made investment in rental property uneconomic. So that is essentially gone. The main obstacle is gone. It's difficult to see how that won't act as an incentive to new supply. I think it will also act as an incentive for smaller landlords to get back into the sector.
So, can I ask you about that argument? It was uneconomic. When we say that, do we mean that they weren't making as much money as they would have liked, or they weren't making money? So, the REITs are certainly making money in this country. It's my understanding, there's money to be made. They'd like to make more, but what investor doesn't want to make more?
Well, the thing is that's exactly the point. Institutional investors, what we mean when we say uneconomic, it simply means that there's other investments that are better. That's what it means. So it doesn't mean it's not profitable. It just means that there's other things that are more profitable and or less risky. Property is reasonably high risk business, so investors want to see a reasonably high rate of return. If rent increases their cap to 2% and interest rates are 4%, say, it makes it difficult to do. So that's the issue. For small-scale landlords, it's a different matter because they're not really involved in the supply of housing as such. And a key point here is that if more small-scale landlords are entering the sector, which I believe will happen, that will place further pressure on house prices. So we are going to see first-time buyers who are currently renting facing higher rents on the one hand, and on the other hand, when they go to buy, they'll be competing with more landlords.
OK. So, Paul, do you accept the premise that we are competing with other kind of investment vehicles for that international capital?
I mean, I accept that, yes, the government is competing.
That we need... Well, let me put it this way. Do you accept the premise that we need to compete with them, that we need that international capital to build the apartments we need?
I think that's the problem, is that this is, market fundamentalism, this is trickle-down economics, and all we have to do is to create the most positive environment possible for these investors to come in and to resolve our housing crisis. I mean, that is kind of what the government has been doing for the past 10 years. Money has been thrown at big landlords, at private developers in terms of HAP, in terms of Croí Cónaithe, in terms of the waiver of various development levies, and so on. There's been a lot of benefits given to investment trusts, etc. Right? OK, they can make more money somewhere else, so they're making the decision to make more money somewhere else. I don't think the answer for that is, OK, we'll make renters pay even more. We'll make more people homeless. I think the answer is to say that this reliance on trying to incentivize the market to work does not work. It's not working for the majority. It's working for those who are at the very top. And instead, we need to say that the state needs a state construction company. We need to build social and affordable housing. So let's not spend the money and invest the money and give the money to developers and then hope that we get some of it back and that the properties come down. Let's just invest in building social and affordable housing. Let's deal with the supply issue ourselves. That's the answer.
Can we afford to do that?
We can. Micheál Martin was in the Dáil today talking about how...
We need about 25 billion.
25 billion.
Yeah.
Sure, that's about the surplus what we had last year when you include the Apple tax. We do have the money. Yeah. This is an investment.
But we need that next year again.
No, we don't need it next year again. We don't. That's the amount that we need to close the gap, right? That's the amount we need. And the fact that
we don't need a one-off investment of 25 billion.
If we would do 25 billion over the next 5 years, that would have a huge impact in terms of it dealing with the housing crisis. Yes, it would.
No, with a growing population, Paul. I mean, it's almost it's capital spending, but it is the effect. It's almost current spending and how you need to rely in terms of the mathematics. But you have to keep going back and building more houses.
But what you have is a return. So if you had a universal access to public housing and people are paying a percentage of their income to access this public housing, we're getting a return that is more than paying for itself, right? And then we have a fund to come back to and to keep investing in housing. Because these landlords...
So what's the income there in that model?
The income is the rent. Is the rent. Why do you think the REITs are investing? They're getting a rent. They're making money. You're making the point correctly. They're making a profit.
Yeah.
But the state could instead invest the massive surplus that we have to resolve the housing crisis and to have an income, which then in turn can be put back into housing.
How much rent are you going to be charging people in order to fund this kind of 25 billion euro annual spending spree?
You charge people a differential rent. You charge people a rent based on their income. So 10% in some counties, as it currently is, 15% in others. That we've done the maths. It more than pays for itself, and then you invest again. It's rejecting the idea that the market has to deliver. The other point I just make, though, is look, you have this illusion out there that it's a terrible market for landlords, they're all fleeing and so on. The RTB came out just recently to make the point we have more tenancies than ever before in this country, we have more landlords than ever before in this country. The RTB made the point that the rate of landlords leaving the market is the lowest ever since the RTB started making records. And why? Well, sure, because they've doubled. In the past 10 years, landlords are doing quite well for themselves, including the institutional landlords. The problem is they want to do even better, and the government wants to
I'm not going to kind of waste time asking you whether you think we should do what Paul says, because I know the answer is no. But let me ask you this, related to what Paul says. What are you going to do if those big Canadian pension funds don't invest in the Irish property sector on foot of these changes?
First of all, you have to accept, and Paul needs to accept, that you do need that investment. And that's what we're trying to create today, create a market that they will invest into.
What if they
don't? Well, I do believe our own main pillar banks need to be loaning out more money.
Michael made the point that they can make a return, but they just make a better return elsewhere. That could continue to be the case. I mean, what will we do if today's announcement don't end up with the Canadian Pension Fund building that apartment block?
Well, the housing agency that has looked at this and made this recommendation believes that it will create a market that they will invest into. As I say, they need something to be viable for them to invest into it. We also need our own pillar banks, Bank of Ireland, AIB, minimal loans given out for the development.
There's no plan B, though.
Of properties. I believe it will be successful. I believe we will get we will get the investment. And increase in new bills.
Yeah,
which
you know the announcements that kind of Alan Kelly would have made when he was in charge of housing, he believed would have been successful. And the announcement Simon Coveney would have made when he was Minister for Housing, he believed would have been successful. And the announcement Owen Murphy made when he was Minister for Housing, he believed would have been successful. And the announcements made by Darragh O'Brien when he was Minister for Housing, he would have believed were successful. I mean, I think we're past the point of just we believe this would be successful.
The recommendations are coming from the Housing Agency. And just, you mentioned at the beginning of the programme, I'm chair of the Housing Committee, so a committee that's to hold the department and hold the Minister to task, and that's what I will do. And next week, I will have the Housing Agency into our committee, where we can ask these pertinent questions and ask them the questions that we need and get the answers that we need to ask. This legislation has to come before committee and Dáil and Shannon over the next number of months. We will get that opportunity next week to ask our Housing Agency why they made these recommendations.
Carol, you mentioned some of the other issues around zoning of land and the streamlining of planning as well. What are the other measures that government could look at or should look at to make the building of those apartments more viable in your mind?
Well, there's a number of things we need to look at, but first I would like to just pick up on that point about the RTB data, because actually we know that the RTB data has been problematic, and they had an issue in terms of lack of registration that they're only now correcting in the last 2 to 3 years. So actually we can't go from A to B with the RTB data. We need to look at what they're judging now. So actually we know in 2021 there were 250,000 landlords registered, and actually that has dropped since then. So all of the agency data is showing us that. So actually we have a problem with the methodology of the RTB data that is in the process of being corrected. So I just think it's really important that we understand what we're dealing with, because the data exists now. We don't need to be debating opinions. The data exists, so we can actually at least use that as a credible indicator. Similarly, in terms of what can be done, I'll tell you what won't help anything be done, and that is the state construction arm. So we need to actually just remove that from the conversation, because it's not only is it derailing the conversations that we need to have, the reality is we have, it is the function of government to facilitate the delivery of infrastructure and housing. And in fact, we've seen through the LGA that is 5 years into its operation now and is only starting to make progress, because it is learning that it is really difficult to develop property in Ireland. They're learning that the red tape can delay for a long time. And what critically they're learning is that it's very difficult to bypass planning delays and to be able to secure the land banks that are needed, even when they're owned by the state. So actually, I think we need to go back to a much more fundamental level of the conversation and be real about where we are. It doesn't help I suppose I think there's some myths that are essentially kind of being repeated here that don't actually aid the conversation. The reality is we have a capable private sector, and they just need to be facilitated to be able to deliver, because that's what we need. We're all pointing towards increased supply. Yeah, well, listen, as you'd expect, lots of people getting in touch on the text line. We're a professional couple in our early 50s. We're still renting and can't save the money for the mortgage because of the high rent. The new legislation doesn't protect the tenants. I'm absolutely shocked with the government decision today. So says one viewer at home.